This video is for Unit 3.2 on the biological molecules, which sometimes I also refer to these as the macromolecules. These are all the molecules that you already made diagrams of in class with the different little plastic pieces, and you had to take the photos of the pictures. So we're just going to go over those in a little bit more detail. You'll want to take notes as we go along. First, before we get into what you want to write down specifically for each macromolecule, though, we need to talk a little bit about some definitions of things that are common to all the macromolecules. The first thing we need to get squared away is what is the difference between a monomer and a polymer. So the first word, monomer, has this prefix in it, mono, for one, and the second word has the prefix poly for many. So whenever you're building one of these macromolecules, the macromolecules themselves are the polymers. So polymer is just kind of another word for your macromolecule, but it has to be built out of many other smaller pieces that we call the monomers. So if you take a look at this picture, if you think of the macromolecule as the whole structure of this Lego house here, so the macromolecule or the polymer is the house, the monomers are each of the individual little bricks that are used to put together to make that house. So the monomers are put together, they're tiny little molecules that are bonded together to make a polymer or a macromolecule. So how do we actually make polymers from monomers then? Well, here's an example of one monomer over here on the right. So this is like a Lego block. And here are 3 Lego blocks that have already been put together. So those are a short polymer because there are many monomers put together. You can see the end of the unlinked monomer has an OH group. It's called a hydroxyl group on the end of it. And the short polymer has a hydrogen on the end of it. Well, when you rip off that hydroxyl group and the hydrogen, you get 2 hydrogens, one from the hydroxyl, one from the hydrogen on its own, and an oxygen called water. So if you rip water off of that short polymer and the unlinked monomer together, you can bond them into a final product, which is a longer polymer. Now instead of our short polymer only having 3 monomers in it, it has 1, 2, 3, 4 monomers in it. And in reality, polymers have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of monomers together. We call this process of adding monomers together, linking them into longer and longer chains, a dehydration reaction. And hopefully that makes sense because we're losing water, right? You take water off of the monomers you're combining and dehydrating them to form this longer polymer. So dehydration reaction, sometimes called a dehydration synthesis because we're building something, synthesizing a polymer, always loses water, and that's how we make monomers into polymers. The second type of reaction you need to know about is how do we break down polymers? So how do we take a big, long polymer and break it down into its monomers? This is what you do when you digest food, for example. Well, we're going to start with, again, a big polymer with 4 monomers hooked together in it. Instead of dehydrating the molecules, however, this time we're going to go through something called hydrolysis, which is the addition of water. So we're going to add water to that molecule, and in the process, half of water goes over here, half of water goes over here, and it splits off a single monomer. So what do we have left over? A monomer here and a shorter chain of monomers, or a shorter polymer, on the left. Again, this process is called hydrolysis because we're adding water in order to break down the polymer. So when you digest your foods, in other words, in order to break them down, you have to use water. You have to add water for that chemical reaction to happen. Okay, this is going to be the beginning then of me going through each of the 4 major biological molecules or macromolecules. For each one, I'm going to go through at the minimum what the names of its monomers are and give some examples, what the names of its polymers are and give some examples of that, and then what is the function of that macromolecule? Why do we need that biological molecule in order to survive? The first biological molecule I'm going to discuss is the carbohydrates. So the monomers, or the building blocks for carbohydrates, are called monosaccharides. Mono, again, meaning one. Saccharide is kind of another word for sugar. So sometimes these carbohydrates are called sugars as well. So what are some of the building blocks for sugars? Well, the one that you made in class was glucose. So glucose is a monomer of carbohydrates. There are a couple others that we didn't build in class but are very similar. There's one called fructose, and then a third one called galactose. Just like glucose has a kind of ring shape, fructose and galactose are also ring-shaped molecules, but they again are the building blocks that we need to build bigger carbohydrate polymers. The polymers for carbohydrates are called polysaccharides. Again, poly meaning many, saccharides meaning sugars. So when we put together a whole bunch of glucose or fructose or galactose molecules, we can build these polysaccharides. Just like we put the individual Lego blocks together to build the house, putting many of the monosaccharides together to build a polysaccharide. I'm going to go through 4 examples of polysaccharides with you. They are starch, cellulose, glycogen, and chitin. So for each of these, I'll give you a little bit of an example of what it's used for, what types of organisms it's found in, and some of its structural information. All right, so starch, first polysaccharide. Starch is found in plants, and I have quite a few examples of plant products that have a lot of starch in them. Bread and pasta from wheat, potatoes have a lot of starch in them as well. What plants use it for is for storage of energy. So the wheat kernel or the potato itself is storing energy for the plant, and it stores it in the form of starch. And you can see it's a bunch of glucose molecules bonded together. Another plant polysaccharide is called cellulose. This should be a C here. Cellulose, again, as I said, is found in plants. And plants use it for structure, for building things. So I like to think of cellulose and celery together. When you bite a piece of celery, you get that nice crunch. That's the structural part of the plant. Okay, the roots, the leaves, the tree trunk, all the branches, a lot of that is built out of cellulose. Very strong structural polysaccharide. You can see, though, again, it's many different individual monomers, monosaccharides, bonded together. Third type, glycogen. Glycogen is found in animals. And we use it for energy storage. So in that way, it's kind of like the starch in plants. We don't have starch to store our energy. Instead, we have glycogen. Now what happens is glycogen is all of the different monosaccharides, usually glucose, bonded together from your food. We pack that off into our livers. The liver will store that glycogen until we need it. And what might we need it for? Well, we might need it for energy for our muscles. So when you start using your muscles for whatever activity it might be, your body takes that glycogen that's stored in your liver and starts to break it down to get energy out of it. And the last one, the last polysaccharide, is also found in animals. Not humans, however, but in other types of animals, and they use it for structure. So again, in that way, it's kind of like the cellulose in plants. So what kind of structure are we talking about here? Talking about the hard outer covering of organisms like lobsters and crayfish and shrimp, and also insects have that exoskeleton as well. But again, common feature, it's many monomers, many monosaccharides joined together to make a polysaccharide. Now, one more thing I want to throw in here before we talk about the function of carbohydrates is there are some important disaccharides as well that we need to discuss. And that word di should give you a clue as to what we're doing here. Di usually means two. So to make a disaccharide, you need to bond two monomers together. Now remember, our carbohydrate monomers were glucose, fructose, and galactose. So different combinations of those create our different disaccharides. So to make sucrose, which is like table sugar, so it's like brown sugar and white sugar and things like that, you're going to put together a glucose molecule plus a fructose molecule. So sucrose is the disaccharide made of two monosaccharides. This one should sound familiar, lactose. People know other people who are lactose intolerant. Lactose is a sugar found in many milk products. So lactose is the disaccharide, and it's formed by joining glucose and galactose, two monosaccharides. And then finally, this one down here, if you've ever heard of malt beer, it just means it's got a particular sugar in it called maltose, which is a disaccharide. It's formed by joining two glucose molecules together. So those three disaccharides, lactose, maltose, and sucrose, are just two single monomers hooked together. But in each case, the type of monomer that is joined affects what that sugar can be used for, the properties of that sugar. All right, let's finish then with the functions of carbohydrates. What are they good for? And you should have a pretty good idea of this now that you know something about them. They do give energy. So they can be an energy source, or they can be used as energy storage. So by energy source, I mean you eat them, you get that energy right away. That would be like your simple, what they're called the monomers or the disaccharides. So those smaller chains of carbohydrates give you quick energy. If you want to store that energy for later, you're going to put it into a polysaccharide like starch or glycogen and store it up for when you need it. We also saw some examples, though, of some carbohydrates that were used for structure, or building structures. And that was the cellulose and the chitin. So not only are they used for energy, but they can also be used to build things.